Hey there, Tom here from agaragetime.com, and today I want to share with you the 5 best tips to remove rust from your classic car. Check it out. The piece we're going to de-rust is this piece right here. It is a piece of the engine tin, goes in the engine bay for this Porsche behind me. And this is a good choice because, well, one, it's rusty. It's been sitting outside for at least 5 years. And it's a pretty difficult piece. You know, whether it's a fender or if it's a piece of tin like this, the rust attacks it no matter what. And this is a thin piece of metal. It's probably 20, 22 gauge, so there's some risk of warping. It's a little bit cumbersome because it's not mounted to a car. It's a little bit floppy because it's very, very flat. It does have a few strengthening ribs on here, but we got to be careful of things like distortion. It has a little bit of paint left on it, so we're going to see which method works the best, starting with number 1. This piece does have a few removable bits. Right here is one of them. And small parts like this, I like to use a chemical, Evaporust. This is super safe rust remover, safe on skin and eyes. Not sure exactly how it works. A lot of people like to use, vinegar or muriatic acid or something as a chemical. But I found whatever's in here just really works. I'm gonna put this in, screws and all, and it still has a little bit of paint on there. I'm not gonna worry about the paint. Mostly I'm just worried about the rust right now. When you buy this, it comes clear. It's a clear solution, but I've used it a few times, so I'm gonna put this off to the side. And this generally takes a long time. I'll probably let this go overnight and come back tomorrow, we'll check it out. I only like to use this for small parts. Now you could buy a 55-gallon drum of this and just submerge the whole thing, and it would work really well. But being a home DIY guy, that would be pretty expensive. I think just this little gallon size here is over $20. Another chemical method that I like for removable parts like this is electrolysis. And it uses a washing soda. In this box, you only need about a cup for a large tub of it, and this is probably $10 for the whole thing. I don't know how many gallons this container is, but it's big enough to get part of that submerged in here. And this will go right here in the middle, so we can get almost all the way to the middle. Other thing we need is a car battery, and I'll hook it up to a trickle battery charger just to replenish the electricity as it gets consumed. A big part like this will take a lot of power. Okay, these are the anodes. They go to the plus. This is the cathode, the piece you're actually trying to de-rust. This is after about 10 minutes, and you can see how there is some motion in the fluid. Parts are kind of circulating around, and these chunks are coming off. Sometimes you'll occasionally see some bubbling, like right there. That's one of the things you need to be careful of. That's hydrogen, and that's why I'm outside right now. You don't want hydrogen building up inside your garage, even though it'd probably take a lot to create a problem, but you can see it's definitely working. So I'm just measuring the current right here. 3.5 amps. Here's how it looks after about 3 hours. I gave it some extra time because it was taking a while. So you get this black residue on here, and it looks bad, but I think with a little bit of wire wheel, this black residue should come off. There's also still some paint on here. The electrolysis doesn't harm the paint, and it doesn't eat into the steel. Once the rust is gone, the process pretty much stops. For wire brush, I like to use a power tool like this one. This is a angle grinder with a cup wire wheel on it. It works pretty quickly. This one's pretty new. Over time, they wear down to, shorter wires, and this is still usable, but not for very much longer. So this brings us into the third method, which is mechanical. Mechanical is the wire brush, wire wheel, and also the strip-it disc. For the strip-it disc, this one is also used. I like to use the angle sander by Makita. This is a low RPM, so it doesn't just eat up the strip-it disc material. This is an abrasive woven material. You can get them for angle grinders too, but I like to start with a bigger diameter. This is what it started as, and this is an 8-inch. And so a lower RPM just preserves the material. This is good for stripping paint. It will take off some rust too. So we'll get to the mechanical methods once we see how the electrolysis worked. Okay, the wire wheel makes pretty quick work of that residue that's left over. And what it also did is it took some of that paint off, which was pretty flaky anyways. You can see this shinier portion is where it was painted. This is a smoother surface. This is the portion that had the surface rust, and it's a darker appearance. You can almost see lines where it just eroded into the material. These are little pits, and most of the pits are clean. Some of them may still be a little bit dirty. It could be the black residue, or it could still be rust in there. Here's a little crack I didn't know I had. I'll have to fix that. Okay, even though it looks like the wire wheel did most of the work, I'm going to demonstrate the wire wheel on this side, and I think you can see the difference on the treated versus the non-treated side with electrolysis. Okay, hopefully this will show the difference between the wire wheel only and the wire wheel with electrolysis. The electrolysis really does do most of the work. What you're left with the wire wheel is you still don't have the rust off. I mean, you get the surface rust and the flaky stuff off, but there's still rust here. And I spent a lot of time in just this section by itself. I spent a little time over here and a little bit over here. The next step up is this abrasive woven material. It doesn't remove much material either, but it's a little bit more aggressive than the wire wheel. So let's give it a try. Okay, you might have seen a few sparks coming off, which is material removal, but it's not bad, and it does a really good job where it was painted. When there's smooth metal underneath, it can take the paint off and leave a really nice shiny finish. But it still has a little trouble getting into the rusty areas, especially the deeper pits. Another method is rust conversion, and I have something here. It's called metal conditioner. It's a DuPont 5717S. And this will condition rust and prepare it for paint on top of it. You got to be careful with these chemicals. It's really not the same as eliminating the rust. So what I like to do with this is use it as kind of an indicator, because if this spots rust, it'll turn it black. Let me show you. Set it here on the piece and grab a little bit of steel wool and just, dab it in and then work it into the surface. Just move it around a little bit. One thing about this is you're not supposed to let it dry on the surface, so I like to wipe it off pretty quickly, and the instructions say to use water. I don't think I'm quite ready for water yet, but I just wipe it down. The metal conditioner will change the shininess of the surface a little bit. It gets it a little bit more dull, But what we're looking for is it really exposes where the rust remains. So if you see some dark areas like in the pits here, that means there's still some amount of rust in those pits. So depending on your level of quality or ambition, you could continue to get some of this black residue out of the pits so that nothing changes black, and that means it's completely rust-free. In most cases, and according to the manufacturer, this is okay to paint over with an epoxy primer, once it's been washed with some water. And over here, this side, didn't fare as well. You can see there's a lot more dark spots where it means that there's rust remaining. So let me hit it one more time with a wire wheel and show you what that does. This is the side with electrolysis, and I tried to get that black material out of the pits, and it's looking, cleaner. And then on this side, I did the same thing, tried to get the black to remove. And I took a little bit of extra time. It's a little bit lighter. Each time you do it, you remove a little bit of rust, but there's still some here. The piece I'm working on is just an engine tin. It's probably not that critical to get every last speck of rust off of it. But if you're working on a exterior panel of your car, like a window channel or a cowl panel or something that is prone to having water sitting on it, you don't want that rust to be reactivated with moisture. And so the best thing to do is to continue to remove the rust. And the last way to do that is, and most people resort to this first, is sandblasting. Sandblasting does a great job at getting into those little pits and removing a lot of rust in real irregular areas. I'm really not set up well for sandblasting. This is a kind of makeshift spot blaster, and it only has a little bit of sand in it. So we're not going to be able to do a big portion of the panel, but the outcome is the same. So let me show you how it works. A commercial outfit would have a much better setup with a high volume nozzle, high pressure, and able to do an entire panel in a short period of time. The danger on doing that to something like this, being so flat and thin, is it's highly likely to warp it. My little spot blaster is unlikely to warp this panel, so we'll try it on here and see how it does. It's pretty clear the areas that I hit with the sandblaster. Kind of went right down here in the middle. Skipped around. I did some of these threaded areas because these are hard to reach with anything but the sandblaster. So I did some spot blasting in those areas. This bracket right here is a good example. Really easy to clean with the spot blaster. And I just did a couple more areas. I hear that crack. I'm going to be welding this, so I wanted to make sure I hit that. But it does do a pretty good job of cleaning things. There are some pits in the metal, like right there, and we'll check this with the metal conditioner and see if we got it all. But it looks like it's pretty clean. It's just messy, takes a lot of space, and you need good equipment, which I don't have. You can see here in the pits, there is still some black that the rust converter is highlighting. This is pretty typical. Even though it looked really clean when it was sandblasted, there's the sandblast finish. And then here it is after the metal conditioner. Those pits still have a tiny bit of rust in there. And it's really up to you how far you want to take it and how much you trust the metal conditioner to prevent future paint problems. In this case, because this is an engine tin, I'm pretty comfortable with this. I will rinse this with water and paint it right away. But if this was something that you're spending a lot of money on with a $20,000 paint job, then you might want to go back over this with the sandblaster or with the wire wheel and continue until all these black spots are gone. after it's been checked with a metal conditioner. That's my opinion. Of course, your results are up to you. Here's the back side. I cleaned, this one is not as rusty. This was mostly cleaned with a strip-it disc and not much pitting on the back side. There's a couple bent flanges here, so I'm just gonna straighten that out. Media blasting is very versatile. I mean, you can get media of all different types. There's vapor blasting, which is basically just adding water to the same sand mixture. And that helps carry away some of the debris and also keeps the dust down. So it's a little bit cleaner. That equipment's a little bit more expensive too. Most DIY guys aren't gonna have a vapor blaster at home. And there's dry ice blasting, which is even more expensive. So depending on your level of detail, sky's the limit on that. Take it to professional if you need to. But I like that little spot blaster to get into really intricate areas like behind those little nut brackets or any of the remaining pits that you just can't get the rust out. The rust converter shows it black. You can just spot blast those like I did on my 911. There was a little bit of rust on the bottom of the door, and I wanted to make sure that all of those pits were super clean. So I wire wheeled it, I went back with the rust converter, I wire wheeled it again, and then the final time was the spot blaster with rust converter and water, and that made sure that there's no more rust right there. It's as good as cutting it out and replacing it with new metal. Let's check up on the Evaporust. It's been 24 hours. There's one. There's two. And the screws are in here too. Wherever there wasn't paint, it's now shiny metal. It doesn't attack the paint. The paint here is pretty loose, so I'll just hit it with my bench grinder, take the paint off. There shouldn't be any rust left anywhere on this. Here's both pieces, wire wheeled on a bench grinder. Because they're small parts, it's easier just to have a stationary bench grinder, and takes the paint off. Screws came out nice too. Okay, the last method is rust converters. And it's similar to the metal conditioner that I showed you from DuPont, although I'm not a big fan of rust converters, especially if it's pretty thick rust, heavy rust. You can convert it, but in my experience, if I've tried those products and it converts the top layer, and then if you go through with the wire wheel, you're gonna get right back to that dusty, flaky rust material. And my opinion is it's just gonna maybe come back and haunt you later on. So it's not my favorite method. Another thing in this category is like POR 15, where you can paint right over rust. And that is true. That stuff is pretty good. It paints right over, it sticks really well. The issue with POR 15, and I'm not a fan of POR 15 by the way, that continues to harden. It's like concrete. It just gets harder and harder and harder. And eventually it's gonna crack. And then when it cracks, the moisture goes in and it meets that old rust, and then you have even a bigger problem. And you won't actually see it because the POR 15 is covering it. Not a fan of rust converters, but that is a popular method, so I'm including it here as item number 5. Okay, here's the piece, completely de-rusted. Backside looks pretty good too. I'm wearing gloves because I'm gonna wipe this down with wax and grease remover and paint it right away. Rust will develop on the surface just with oils or because of the humid air. It happens like within 30 minutes. So as soon as the wax and grease remover dries, I'm gonna paint it. And that's the recommended thing to do. Epoxy primer would be the best choice on this, but because this is an internal tin piece, I'm just gonna spray rustoleum directly on this and I'll be done. I did use a slightly different wire wheel on some of these areas where the ribs are. This small wire wheel on a drill was able to, get some of the remaining paint off and some of those rust pits out. It came in especially handy on the back side. This wire wheel just sort of fits in these grooves really well, so I did use that. Also in this groove right here, it was really helpful. So to summarize, what's my favorite method out of the 5 best ways to strip rust off of your metal parts on your classic car? I think for me on this part, the most effective method was electrolysis. Now that's only possible if your part's removable. This was a pretty big piece. I had to do it in 2 steps, but the electrolysis by far was the most effective in getting the rust out of the deep pits. And then a quick wire wheel and I was essentially done. There were a few areas in the middle that I couldn't reach. Those were done with wire wheel and a little bit of sandblasting. If it's a part on your car and you can't remove it, well then electrolysis isn't going to be the most effective. So every situation's a little different. The most effective way, like on a door or a fender that's too big to dip into electrolysis bath, is wire wheel. Well, number 1, strip a disc to get the bulk of the paint off, wire wheel to get the bulk of the rust off, and then I like the spot blaster in areas that show black after you've treated it with the rust and converter, the rust conditioner or the metal conditioner. So there you go. That's my 5 tips for how to remove rust on your classic car. Thanks for watching. I hope that helped.